Well, I was finishing a book on '68 that I had worked on for years and years. And I was sitting at my work table and had all of this data from all over the world and had one of these eureka moments where I realized that the protests in Vietnam and the uprising, the Tet Offensive, February '68, had affected a conference in Berlin, Germany, of anti-war activists, many of whom were from France, who had helped spark the May uprising in France, the May events, near revolutionary situation in 1968, which in turn led to general strikes in Italy and Spain, movements in Mexico, and realized Senegalese were affected by that, Columbia University, and the ways in which protests had broken out was more related to each other than to domestic political conditions, economic conditions, and ways that social movements are normally conceptualized. And as I tried to grapple with a way to get a handle on what had happened, Herbert Marcuse's notion of eros and of political eros, which he had been developing, crystallized as the eros effect, meaning that in certain moments in time, out of the blue, universal interests become generalized, that people, instead of going about their daily lives seeking to be happy to maximize their own individual gain, actually are more concerned with the universal questions of peace or of prosperity for all, not just for themselves. So this eros, meaning people's love for each other, humanity's love for all human beings, is a very powerful force. I would say it's the most important natural resource on the planet, is human love for each other. The broad meaning of the term, solidarity, people's understanding that human life and that all life is of value. So in moments when this can be crystallized and actualized, those moments of the eros effect have a great deal to do with how history's direction has changed. Besides 1968, the Asian uprisings of 1980 to 1998, there was a string of Asian uprisings, which I've been trying to analyze, from Gwangju, South Korea, then in 1986, the Philippines, 87, South Korea, 88, Burma, 89, Tibet and China, 1990, Taiwan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, 1992, Thailand. These were related to each other much more than they were related to any domestic political conditions. These are societies vastly different in religion, economy, language, cultural heritage. Yet in all of these societies, millions of ordinary people stood up to their governments and demanded very similar kinds of changes. Similarly, then, in the Arab world today, out of the blue, all of a sudden, we have many different people suffering from many different types of political regimes rising up demanding greater liberties. I think if you tried to find what variable united these various instances of revolt, it would be other instances of revolt, the subjective factor, as opposed to dry objective factors. And I think this understanding shows that, in fact, people are ready to change the direction of history. I see the combination of all of these eros effect episodes leading to a protracted global uprising against neoliberalism and war, in which people's energies are going to be co-opted by the system unless some kind of leadership emerges that can provide an alternative vision for how these might be resolved. So it seems to me that what's most important in moments of the eros effect is to create meaningful public space where many diverse constituencies can air their perspectives. It's not a question of trying to impose the correct political line on these popular eruptions. It's a question of feeding the eruption and of directing it in ways that challenge and undermine the structures of the system. Now, the very powerful men and women at the top of society also understand this great power of popular movements in the streets. They are seeking to redirect it as well. So how can the movement redirect it if the movement doesn't have some prior organization. This is the dilemma. Clearly in Tahrir Square, the space was wide open, and ordinary citizens of all varieties, from the Muslim Brotherhood to very left-wing Egyptians, came to Tahrir Square and spoke up, aired their viewpoints. And this, to me, this diversity is a real strength of the movement. The army very cleverly cleared the square a few days after Mubarak left office and took control of that public space. So I think all of these popular movements realize what's key is to have a public meeting space where they can have the movement's focal point happen in a direct democratic fashion. And the regimes realize that they need to deny this public meeting space to people. I wish I could say I was optimistic about the future of Egypt. And I think there could be reasons to be, but what I understand as having happened in Egypt is that the military has effectively managed a transition. In terms of institutional power, it seems that top-down power has been maintained. Immediately after Mubarak fell, there was a wave of strikes in offices. People were saying the employees are no longer listening to the bosses. Even the police were being attacked on the street. So all over the country, in every kind of institution, people were demanding a change. And yet, that was effectively stopped because Tahrir Square was seized by the military. This referendum that was rushed through effectively hands power over to established groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other parties that already existed, meaning that the impetus from below did not have time to crystallize organizations that could have provided real alternative visions. So in that count as well, I'm not optimistic about the future of Egypt. Of course, one of the real factors in the Egyptian uprising that surprised many people was the participation of women in leadership positions as well as in the square. In a society that is often regarded as patriarchal, Islamic, women stepped forward and played a very progressive role. And I think that signals a wider social transformation in Egypt. We'll have to see the extent to which social relations can be changed from the bottom up, but it seems like institutional power remains intact in Egypt at this moment. If they have been able to overthrow Mubarak, then the power and energy of that action will remain with them as a lasting historical legacy. They know that they can overthrow Mubarak. They did it. This means they can overthrow the next ruler as well. If they will be able to mobilize against rulers is another question. One thing is very clear to me, and that is that the United States is very insistent upon maintaining its interests. So whether or not people think the United States is acting altruistically or for greater democracy, I believe the United States is acting in its own interests. So U.S. interests are not to maintain regimes that are not in the interests of the United States. That means Mubarak, longtime friend of the United States and of Israel, was suddenly a threat to American and Israeli strategic interests because the growing movement against him would have been much more radical if it came to power. Instead, the U.S. rode the wave of the popular uprising to ease Mubarak out of power with his billions of dollars probably intact, and then establish a military control of Egypt in a transitional period. Now, the U.S. will look very good if the military, in fact, does cede power to a newly elected civilian government, but you can be sure that that civilian government will maintain the very same interests of the United States, of Israel, and of the Egyptian elite. It will not be the interests of the vast majority of Egyptian people who are living at standards of living you and I would find unacceptable. The same can be true in South Korea. There were people who were motivated by many different reasons. But what makes the movement's outcome so similar is that in both cases, the democratic transition occurred, but it was managed by the military. In both cases, the military was able somehow to take the opinions of the majority of its people and say, well, we'll take care of you. After all, we're benevolent. We're your military. And this, in both cases, is an astonishing outcome of these uprisings. It shows how the real lack of people's leadership, of genuine leadership that could have provided an alternative, was lacking. The Eros effect is an effective way of transferring power to new governments from dictators, but it is not effective as a means to institute new systems of popular power. And I think we need to understand the limitations of the Eros effect. It's not a all-in-all solution. It's a tactic in the final analysis. It's the military that is deciding who's imprisoned. It's the military that is arresting and even torturing young activists who are responsible for bringing people together in Tahrir Square. So as long as Egyptians tolerate that situation, it's a very desperate one. And the lesson from the past uprisings is that those uprisings need to be supported by everyone. If, for instance, workers insist somehow that minorities' rights are not as important as workers' rights, or that women's rights are not as important as workers' rights, the movement will have been divided between its various constituencies. So some mechanisms have to be found to unite these various constituencies. This is a very clear lesson from these past uprisings, that the system is quite adept at divide and conquer strategies. And we need to find unite and conquer strategies in terms of dealing with the capitalist class and the generals at the top of the government apparatus. Now, the ongoing struggles that we are seeing in the Arab world are only the latest episode. The disarmament movement in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I mentioned the Asian uprisings in the 80s, the Eastern European uprisings in the 80s and early 90s, the ultra-globalization movement, the Zapatista movement. What we are seeing globally are relationships between movements that spark each other, that lead each other forward. You know, we tend to forget that today, that in 1999, from Seattle until the September 11th attacks, every major elite summit had major protests against it by thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. We forget that even in February 15th, 2003, millions of people all over the world went into the streets to oppose the US war even before it started. When you look at the ultra-globalization movement against the WTO, IMF, World Bank, no one directed people to protest world capitalism. Millions of people all over the planet made their own choice. Ordinary people's consciousness was at a much higher level than the elite of any nation state, and certainly at a much higher level than the capitalist class. So it seems to me that that realization by millions of ordinary people might have been negated by Al-Qaeda's attacks on the World Trade Center and the war on terror, but only in a temporary fashion. It will reemerge at a higher level as history moves on. And we will see, as I say, a global, protracted uprising against capitalism and warfare.
Take these words home and think.